They burned Chuck Norris's house at night, but they never imagined what it would cost them. Subscribe and comment where you're watching from. The road narrowed as Chuck Norris drove deeper into the countryside, the cracked asphalt curling through endless rows of trees. It had been hours since he had seen another car, and that was exactly what he wanted. The air drifting through the open window carried the sharp scent of pine and damp earth, and with each breath, he felt the noise of his former life peeling away like an old coat he no longer needed. Cities, flights, gyms, studios, all of it was behind him now. What lay ahead was silence, and he intended to embrace it. The truck rattled over a stretch of gravel as a weathered sign came into view at the side of the road. The name of the town was so faded that the letters had been eaten by years of sun and rain. He slowed to read it, but gave up when only shadows of words remained. Maybe it was better that way. He wasn't here to make the town famous, nor to become part of its story. He was here to disappear, to find a place where no one asked questions and no one expected answers. The lane that led to his new property was little more than a dirt track, with weeds growing through its middle. Dust rose in clouds behind the truck as he eased it along, the engine growling low. At the end of the lane, framed by tall pines that leaned in like guardians, stood the cabin. From a distance, it was almost swallowed by the forest, the roof dark against the canopy, the paint peeling, the shutters crooked. But as he stopped the truck and climbed out, Chuck felt something that surprised him. Recognition. This was the kind of place he had seen in memories more than once. Rough edges, imperfect, but built for a man who wanted nothing more than to sit in silence and listen to his own thoughts. He stood for a while just breathing, listening to the wind push gently through the trees and the faint sound of water somewhere nearby. Then he shouldered his duffel and stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked under his boots, and the screen door groaned like it hadn't been opened in years. Inside, the smell of cedar, dust, and old summers filled the air. It was a single-room cabin with a wood stove in the corner, a scarred table with 2 chairs, and a narrow hallway that led to a small bedroom where a quilt lay neatly folded at the end of the bed. Everything carried the weight of time. He ran his hand over the table, feeling grooves worn into the wood by long-forgotten meals. For a moment, he pictured people sitting there decades earlier, laughing, passing bread, arguing gently, living in the rhythm of this place. He unpacked slowly, as if each folded shirt, each pair of jeans placed carefully on the shelf, marked a small claim on this refuge. He hung his jacket on a nail by the door, set his boots neatly under the bed, and placed his toothbrush on the edge of the sink. Simple, methodical actions, but they gave shape to the emptiness. By late afternoon, the cabin felt less like a relic and more like his own. When he stepped onto the back porch with his folding chair and fishing rod, the world opened. The lake stretched out behind the cabin like a sheet of silver, mist curling off its surface even in the warmth of the day. It shimmered with a stillness that suggested secrets, the kind of water that held stories as old as the land itself. Chuck unfolded the chair at the end of the dock, assembled his rod with the practiced ease of a man who had done it 1,000 times, baited the hook, and cast the line. The float bobbed lightly, tracing faint ripples on the glassy water. He leaned back, exhaled, and felt his shoulders unclench for the first time in months. The sounds around him were soft and steady, birds skittering across the water, the creak of the dock beneath him, the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. His breathing slowed. Each inhale was deeper than the last. Each exhale carried the weight of tension unwinding. He had spent too many years in places where silence was impossible, where every second was filled with demands, noise, or danger. Here the world shrank to lake, sky, and time dripping slow as molasses. At dusk he reeled in a shimmering fish, admired the light dancing across its scales, and then unhooked it carefully, letting it slip back into the water. He smiled faintly. That was enough. He didn't need trophies. He needed the rhythm of release. When night fell and the first stars appeared, he returned to the cabin, lit the stove, brewed coffee, and sat at the table, savoring the aroma as it filled the small room. The quiet outside pressed gently against the windows, not threatening, but embracing. He had found what he came for. The next morning he drove into town to buy supplies. The main street was a spine of faded buildings that seemed frozen in another decade. A general store sagged in the middle, a diner's neon sign flickered dimly in the window. People moved slowly, with cautious eyes that lingered on him, a heartbeat too long, before looking away. Inside the store, a man behind the counter wiped his hands on a rag that had seen better days. His expression was curious but not unfriendly. "Morning," Chuck said, setting a few items on the counter. "You staying long?" The man asked after a pause, his tone careful. "Just here to fish," Chuck answered. He smiled faintly and counted out cash. The man hesitated, then said, "Watch yourself by the lake. Folks around here got strong opinions about who belongs where." Chuck studied him for a moment. The words were not casual. They carried the weight of someone who wanted to warn without drawing too much attention. He nodded. "Thanks for the advice." The man only shrugged, bagging the supplies, his eyes already shifting toward the window as if afraid someone might have seen him speaking too openly. Outside, a woman sweeping her porch paused to glance at Chuck before lowering her gaze quickly. An old man with a cane sat outside the diner, his hat pulled low, eyes hidden in shadow. Chuck noticed how the people moved, too quiet, too careful, like animals conditioned to flinch at unseen predators. But he didn't press. He had seen it before, in places far more dangerous than this. Every community had its own rules, its own unspoken laws. He wasn't here to challenge them, not yet. He loaded the bag into the truck, climbed in, and drove back to the cabin. The lake was waiting. That evening he sat again on the dock, casting his line, breathing in the dusk as the water reflected streaks of fire from the sinking sun. The words of the storekeeper lingered in his mind like a faint echo. Watch yourself by the lake. He wondered what kind of man looked at water, a gift from nature, and claimed ownership of it. But he let the thought drift away with the current. The stillness of the lake pressed in around him, and he allowed himself to believe, if only for a moment, that this peace could last. The cabin creaked in the wind that night as he lay on the narrow bed. His eyes closed easily, his body sinking into the mattress with the weight of long-earned exhaustion. But even as sleep claimed him, something stirred deep inside, the old instinct whispering what he already knew. Peace was never permanent. Sooner or later, someone would come to disturb it, and when they did, he would be ready. The days settled into a rhythm that almost fooled Chuck into thinking he had finally found what he was looking for. Morning coffee on the porch, the lake breathing softly through the trees, the line cast into still waters, and evenings when the cabin filled with the quiet hum of insects and the low call of owls. Yet beneath the surface of calm, he felt it, an unease that had nothing to do with nature. It lingered in the looks he caught on the faces of townsfolk, in the quick way their eyes slid away from his when he greeted them, in the half-finished sentences that trailed into silence whenever he entered a room. He had seen that sort of fear before, in villages far from here, places where power belonged not to law, but to men who mistook intimidation for order. It was early one afternoon when the silence cracked. Chuck had driven out to buy nails and kerosene at the general store. As he walked back to his truck, he heard raised voices from the edge of town. He followed the sound to a farm on the outskirts, where an older man was loading sacks of grain into his pickup. The sun was hot, the air thick with dust. But what struck Chuck was not the heat, it was the sudden rumble of an engine. A black pickup came barreling up the dirt road, stopping in a spray of gravel. 3 men jumped out, broad and rough, their laughter carrying as though they had already won. Chuck stopped on the roadside, far enough not to intrude but close enough to watch. The farmer froze as the men approached. The one in front, tall and heavy-set with dark glasses, jabbed a finger at the sacks. "Half of it. Loaded into our truck." The farmer's jaw tightened. He said nothing, only lifted another sack with shaking arms and placed it in his own vehicle. One of the men snorted, walked over, and with casual cruelty shoved the farmer aside. "Didn't you hear? Half goes to us. You want to keep your barn standing, old man?" The farmer's children were visible in the farmhouse window, their small faces pressed against the glass. Chuck could see their fear, the way their eyes darted to their father, then back to the strangers. The farmer said nothing. He bent, picked up a sack, and handed it over. His silence was louder than protest. Chuck clenched his jaw, every part of him ready to step forward, but he forced himself to stay still. This was not his fight, not yet. He needed to know who these men were. When the sacks were loaded into the black pickup, the leader laughed, clapped the farmer on the shoulder hard enough to make him stumble, and then they drove away, leaving a trail of dust and the echo of a stolen harvest. Chuck watched them disappear and turned back toward his own truck. The scene burned into his mind. That evening in the diner, he heard the name whispered for the first time. The waitress, a thin woman with tired eyes, lowered her voice when she saw him listening. "That's Red Caldwell's crew. Don't stare when they walk in. Just keep your head down." The name settled like ash in the back of Chuck's throat. Caldwell. He asked nothing more, but he remembered the black pickup, the way the men carried themselves, not like workers, not even like soldiers, but like predators fattened on other people's fear. It wasn't long before he saw Red Caldwell himself. The following morning, Chuck returned to town for coffee beans. As he left the store, the sound of laughter rolled across the street. A man stood at the center of the main road as if he owned it. Broad-shouldered, though softened by age and indulgence, with a rust-colored beard and eyes that flickered sharp behind a lazy grin, he exuded a kind of arrogance that demanded attention. His belt sagged with a holstered pistol he touched now and then, like a reminder, not because he needed it, but because he enjoyed letting others see. "Red," someone muttered near Chuck, and the word was not spoken like a name, but like a warning. Caldwell's eyes swept the street, and when they landed on Chuck, they lingered just long enough to register the stranger before moving on. He walked into the diner with two men at his back. Chuck recognized them. One was the silent brute from the farm, the other younger, wiry with restless eyes and a smirk that suggested he liked causing pain more than watching it. A third lingered near the door, lean, sly, his gaze darting like a rat's. Chuck knew the type instantly. Caldwell was the head, but without these three shadows, his reach would never stretch as far. Inside the diner, Caldwell leaned against the counter as if it were his own, demanding the ledger from the owner. His voice carried over the murmur of patrons. "Let's see who's behind this month. We can't have folks thinking they can slack off." The owner, an aging man with a bent back, handed it over with shaking hands. Caldwell flipped through the pages, nodding as though he were a banker instead of a bully, then closed the book and slapped it down. "Good man," he said loudly, making sure every ear in the room heard. "See how easy life is when we all play by the rules?" Chuck watched through the window from across the street. The performance was not for the diner owner. It was for everyone else. He recognized it immediately. The theater of domination. A man like Caldwell didn't need to beat someone every day. He needed only to remind them that he could. Later that day, Chuck's own introduction to Caldwell's crew came. He had gone back into the store for a box of nails when the three shadows stepped inside. Their boots thudded heavy on the wooden floor, their laughter too loud for such a small room. "Well, well," the younger one said, his grin widening when he saw Chuck at the counter. "Look at this. Fresh blood." Chuck turned, met his gaze, and answered with the calm tone he had used countless times before, in places more dangerous than this. "Just buying what I need." The brute Graham, if Chuck remembered correctly from whispers in the diner, snorted, folding arms like tree trunks across his chest. The smaller one, with darting eyes, leaned against the shelf and tilted his head. "You new here?" the wiry one asked, stepping closer. "People don't usually come to stay, not unless they know the rules." Chuck paid for his nails, placed the bag under his arm, and said simply, "I came to fish. That's all." The wiry one chuckled. "Fish, huh? Better hope your line doesn't cross water that doesn't belong to you." The store went silent. Even the owner avoided looking at them. Chuck could feel the weight of the threat, but he only nodded and walked out. Behind him, their laughter followed, sharp and mocking, but he did not let it touch him. His steps were steady, his breath even, but inside he filed away every detail, their voices, their arrogance, their need for an audience. That night, as he sat by the lake, the words returned like ripples on water. "Don't cross where you don't belong." He wondered what kind of man claimed a lake. He stared at his reflection in the water and thought of Caldwell's eyes, the smirk of his men, the way fear had woven itself into the bones of this town. He had not come here to fight, but the fight was already circling. He could sense it the way an old soldier senses weather before it breaks. The next day, as he repaired a loose board on the porch, a knock sounded at his door. It was his neighbor, a woman in her 40s with lines etched deep from worry rather than age. She carried a pie wrapped in cloth and looked over her shoulder twice before speaking. "They saw you at the store," she said quickly, thrusting the pie into his hands. "Don't answer back. Whatever they say, don't answer. It's easier that way." Chuck thanked her, placed the pie on the table, and asked quietly, "Is it easier or just quieter?" Her eyes filled with something between fear and shame, and she turned away without replying. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and the lake turned copper under the fading light, Chuck sat with his rod untouched beside him. The float drifted without attention. He was listening instead, listening to the silence that wasn't silence at all, but the heavy quiet of a town under a shadow. He had seen it before. He knew what it meant. And though he had come here for peace, he understood now. Peace would not come unless someone stood against the shadow. The red shadow had shown itself, and it was only a matter of time before it reached for him directly. The days that followed unfolded with an uneasy rhythm, like the moments before a storm when the air hangs heavy and every sound seems sharper than it should be. Chuck continued with his quiet life at the cabin, fishing at dawn, repairing the porch, splitting firewood. On the surface, it looked as though he had taken the warnings to heart, accepted the way things worked in town. But beneath the calm, he felt the eyes. Every time he went to the store, every time he walked the dirt road, someone was watching. Sometimes it was just a curtain shifting, sometimes a glance too quick to be casual, sometimes a shadow that lingered a second longer than it should have. The red shadow, as Chuck had come to think of Caldwell's reach, was all around. One evening, after a long day spent repairing a leak in the roof and mending an old fence post by the edge of the trees, Chuck took his rod and headed for the lake. The water mirrored the setting sun, streaks of orange and gold stretching across its surface. He cast his line and sat back, letting the dock creak beneath his weight. The stillness should have been enough to settle him, but the memory of Caldwell's men in the store, their mocking laughter, their deliberate warnings, circled in his mind like vultures. He thought again of the neighbor woman and her words. "Don't answer back. It's easier that way." He had seen too many places where silence was mistaken for safety. He knew what happened when people gave in, piece by piece. The silence became a cage, and soon enough, no one remembered what it was like to speak freely. He exhaled slowly and let the thought drift with the ripples of the lake. For now, he told himself, patience. By the time he reeled in and packed up, the forest was dark, and the night carried with it the faint smell of pine and damp earth. He walked back to the cabin, lit the stove, and made a pot of coffee. The simple act of pouring it into a tin cup, hearing the hiss of the fire, should have been enough. Yet as he settled at the table, the uneasy quiet pressed in harder than before. Outside, the forest was alive, but beneath its sounds was something else, a waiting that he could not shake. Sometime after midnight, a sound woke him. Not the normal creaks of the cabin or the sigh of wind through the trees, but something sharper, out of place. He lay still for a moment, listening. The sound came again, faint but unmistakable, the crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. His hand slid instinctively toward his boots. He had lived too many years in places where footsteps at night rarely meant anything good. He rose silently, crossed to the window and peered out through the narrow gap in the shutters. At first he saw nothing but the shifting darkness of the trees. Then a glow, small, flickering, moving low to the ground. The glow grew brighter, multiplied. His pulse quickened. He opened the door and stepped onto the porch, and the heat hit him even before his eyes fully registered it. Flames were licking up the side of the cabin. The fire spread quickly, catching on the dry wood, climbing hungrily toward the roof. Sparks shot into the air, carried by the wind. Chuck ran back inside, grabbing for what little he could. The smoke thickened almost instantly, choking the air, stinging his eyes. He yanked open the drawer by the bed, found the old photograph he had placed there earlier that week, and stuffed it into his pocket. From the hook by the door, he pulled down his jacket. The heat was already unbearable. the crack of wood snapping as the fire devoured the cabin. He pushed his way out through the front, coughing hard, and stumbled onto the dirt. The cabin was engulfed now, the roof ablaze, the flames roaring high into the night sky. Sparks fell around him like a storm. He stood there, chest heaving, watching the place he had hoped would bring him peace, burn into ruin. At the edge of the trees, shadows moved. He caught the sound of laughter, low, mocking, cruel. Figures stood just beyond the line of firelight, too far to make out clearly, but close enough to be sure of what they had done. The laughter faded into the darkness as they slipped away, leaving behind nothing but the crackle of fire and the ruin it had made. Neighbors began to gather along the road, their faces pale in the glow of the flames. No one moved to help, not at first. They stood in clusters, murmuring, some crossing themselves, some just shaking their heads. Chuck looked at them, their eyes wide, their shoulders slumped with the weight of helplessness. No one dared step forward. No one dared defy the fire that had been set as a warning. By dawn, nothing remained of the cabin but a blackened skeleton, the air thick with smoke and the bitter smell of ash. Chuck stood among the ruins, his clothes streaked with soot, his hands blistered where he had tried to beat back flames with a shovel. He had saved nothing but the photograph, now smudged with smoke, and the jacket he wore on his back. The growl of an engine cut through the silence. The black pickup pulled up with a spray of gravel, and Red Caldwell stepped out, his boots thudding heavily on the ground. His men followed, standing a few paces behind, arms folded, smirks etched on their faces. "Well, stranger," Caldwell said, loud enough for the small crowd to hear, "looks like your welcome party got a little too warm." He laughed, spreading his arms as though to say it was out of his hands. "See, we don't take kindly to folks thinking they can settle here without knowing how things work. Maybe this'll help you remember." The townsfolk stood silently, their eyes darting between Caldwell and Chuck. Caldwell's voice rose, sharp and cruel. "Let this be a lesson. Nobody lives here without my say. Not on the lake, not on the land, not anywhere." He turned to the crowd, his grin wide. "You all understand, don't you? This is what happens when someone forgets who keeps order around here." Murmurs spread, weak and fearful. No one met Chuck's eyes. He stood still, his face expressionless, his gaze steady on Caldwell. Caldwell stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Chuck could hear. "Leave, old man. Pack what you got left and get out while you still can. Next time, it won't just be your house that burns." Chuck said nothing. He didn't move. He let Caldwell's words hang in the smoky air, let the silence stretch. Then Caldwell turned away, swaggering back to his truck, his men laughing as they followed. The engine roared, and the vehicle disappeared down the road, leaving behind the smoldering ruin and a silence heavier than any words. The people began to drift away, one by one, some shaking their heads, others keeping their eyes fixed on the ground. A few lingered, as though they wanted to say something but couldn't summon the courage. Finally, even they turned and left. Chuck remained, standing in the ashes of the place he had begun to think of as home, the weight of the night pressing on his shoulders. He bent, picked up a charred piece of wood, and let it crumble to dust in his hand. The fire had taken everything he had brought with him, everything he had tried to build. But as he looked out across the wreckage, he felt something else stir beneath the loss. Not despair, not even anger. Resolve. The fire had been meant to break him, to send him running like all the others. Instead, it had stripped him of the last thing tying him to caution. He had nothing left to lose, and that made him dangerous. The sun rose over the trees, casting long beams of light across the blackened ground. Chuck straightened, brushed the ash from his hands, and turned his gaze toward the town. The Red Shadow thought he had won, but the war that Caldwell believed was over had only just begun. The days after the fire passed with a weight that settled over everything like smoke that refused to lift. Chuck slept in his truck, the back seat barely long enough for his frame, the ash-covered ground outside still smoldering in places. The cabin that had offered him quiet had been reduced to blackened beams and dust. The porch where he drank his coffee, nothing more than charred splinters scattered by the wind. At night, the ruin glowed faintly in the moonlight, and in the silence he could almost hear the laughter of the men who had stood in the trees and watched it burn. He did not rage. and he did not curse. He sat, he watched, and he thought. Each morning, he woke before the sun and walked the perimeter of what remained, his boots crunching in the brittle ash. He sifted through the rubble for anything worth saving, but there was nothing. The photograph he had managed to rescue was propped on the dashboard of his truck, a reminder that not everything had been taken from him. But aside from that, he had only the clothes on his back and the weight of a decision forming inside him. He told himself he had come here for peace, for quiet, for the rhythm of water and sky. Yet peace had been taken from him the moment Caldwell decided to make an example. If Caldwell thought fire would frighten him away, then the man had misunderstood entirely. By the third day, Chuck began walking into town again. People watched him with uneasy eyes as he passed, the blackened soot still staining his jacket, the calm set of his jaw unchanged. He went into the general store for bread and canned beans, and the shopkeeper could barely meet his gaze. Chuck set his purchases on the counter, and the man hesitated before speaking. "You should leave," the shopkeeper murmured, glancing toward the window as though afraid someone might hear. "Red won't stop. You already saw what he's willing to do." Chuck placed cash on the counter and looked at him steadily. "It was my house last night. Tomorrow it will be yours, or his, or hers." His gaze flicked toward a woman folding laundry on the porch across the street, her head bent low as though she could hide from the words. "You think silence will protect you, but it only feeds him." The shopkeeper's lips pressed thin, and he shook his head. "You don't understand. We tried once. We tried years ago. He broke bones, ruined families. Better to be quiet. Better to keep what little we have." Chuck collected his bag, his tone quiet but certain. "What you have isn't yours if he decides to take it. You're not keeping anything. You're waiting for him to decide what you're allowed to hold." He didn't wait for an answer. He stepped outside, the screen door slamming shut behind him, and walked down the street under the wary eyes of the people who heard. Later that afternoon, as he leaned against his truck eating bread, an old man with a cane hobbled up. Chuck had seen him before, sitting outside the diner, watching with tired eyes. Now he moved slowly, each step deliberate, his hat pulled low against the sun. He stopped a few feet away, rested heavily on the cane, and spoke in a gravelly voice. "You're the one whose place burned." Chuck nodded. "That was me." The old man tapped his cane against the ground. "I saw the fire, saw the smoke, saw Red drive by afterward, like he'd just done a day's work worth praising." His eyes lifted, clouded but steady. "You don't know how many nights I've seen the same thing. Different houses, different faces. He's been doing it so long, people stopped believing anything could change." "Why do you still stay?" Chuck asked, his voice even. The old man let out a humorless laugh. "Where would I go? My legs barely carry me down this street. This is the only home I've ever had. And once I tried to fight. Told him he had no right to take my boat from the dock. That night, 2 of his men came. They beat me so bad the doctor said I'd never walk right again." He was right. He tapped the cane as if to underline the point. "So I keep quiet now. We all do. Better to live half a life than none at all." Chuck crouched so he was level with the man's eyes. "Half a life isn't living. It's waiting. And if you wait long enough, he'll take the rest too." The old man looked at him for a long moment, then shook his head. "You sound like I used to, but words won't save you here. Not against him." He turned and hobbled away, his cane striking the ground like a drumbeat of resignation. That night, Chuck sat by the ruin of his cabin. The wind stirred ashes into the air, carrying them like ghosts. He built a small fire in a circle of stones, brewed coffee in the battered pot he had salvaged from the wreck, and stared into the flames. The firelight reflected in his eyes, not with fear, but with a steady focus. The cabin was gone, stripped from him, but it had taken with it the last tether to caution. He had come here wanting to be left alone. Now, with nothing left to lose, he found himself holding something else entirely, a purpose. In the days that followed, Chuck walked the town more often. He listened to whispers, to stories people carried like secrets they were too afraid to speak loudly. A young woman admitted that her brother had once tried to fight back when Caldwell's men took their boat. She had gone after him, begged Red to return it. Instead, he had cornered her, his voice dripping with threats until she fled in tears. Her brother never dared speak again, and she had learned to lower her eyes. A farmer told him quietly that every year he had to hand over part of his harvest to Red's so-called community fund. Everyone knew it was theft, but no one called it that aloud. Better to lose a share than the whole farm. A mother whispered that her children had been fined for swimming in the lake, Red insisting it was his right to control who touched the water. She paid with money she didn't have, terrified that worse would come if she resisted. Each story was another stone added to the weight on Chuck's shoulders, but instead of crushing him, it only hardened his resolve. He saw the fear in their eyes, the shame in their silence, and he recognized it. He had seen villages under the thumb of warlords, towns where the law had become a mask worn by a single man. It always looked the same, the quiet, the bowed heads, the eyes that darted away too quickly. And it always ended the same way too, when someone finally decided enough was enough. One evening, as the sun slid low and painted the town in golden shadow, Chuck stood at the edge of what had been his home. The ashes lay silent, but in them he saw more than ruin. He saw the line Caldwell had drawn in the dirt, daring him to step across. Chuck had never been one to walk away from a line like that. As the night deepened, he sat on the hood of his truck, the photograph propped against the windshield. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars he had seen in deserts and jungles, in cities torn apart by fear. He thought of the neighbor's words, "Don't answer back." He thought of the old man with the cane, broken but still alive. He thought of the woman who had fled from Red's threats, of the children forced from the lake. He sipped the last of his coffee and set the cup down beside him. His face was calm, his breath steady, but inside the decision was firm. He would not run. He would not let fire be the final word. They had tried to burn him out, to drive him away. Instead, they had freed him from the need for patience. When he finally slid into the truck to rest, the ruins of the cabin lay in the rearview mirror, black against the night. But in his eyes there was no defeat, only resolve, sharp and unyielding. Red Caldwell thought he had ended a man's peace. What he had really done was awaken a storm. And storms, Chuck knew, did not ask permission. They simply came. The ashes of the cabin lay quiet, black and brittle in the mornings, white and weightless in the afternoons when the sun baked them dry. Chuck spent his nights there, sometimes sitting on the hood of his truck, sometimes leaning against the blackened frame that once had been his porch, always watching, waiting. To the people of the town, it might have looked as though the stranger had accepted his punishment. He had lost his home, he had been warned, and yet he stayed, silent and still among the ruins. To Red Caldwell, it was a curiosity at first, then an irritation, and finally a challenge. Men like Caldwell could not abide defiance, not even the quiet kind. By the end of the week, whispers had spread through the town. The stranger had not left. He slept among the ruins, ate simple meals in the open, and walked the streets as though the fire had done nothing but scorch wood. Each time he passed, people looked at him longer now, some with pity, some with fear, and some with something different, something that might have been hope. Chuck saw it in their eyes, even if they tried to hide it. They wanted him to stand because they could not. It was just after dawn when the sound of engines came rumbling up the dirt road. Chuck straightened from where he had been stacking stones into a crude fire circle, his eyes narrowing as two trucks appeared. The first was the black pickup, Caldwell's mark, its tires grinding through the gravel with unnecessary force. The second was older, rust eating at the fenders, but it was full of people, townsfolk standing and sitting in the back. Word had spread, and they had come, not to help, not yet, but to watch. The truck stopped in a cloud of dust. Red Caldwell climbed out, his boots striking the earth with the confidence of a man who had ruled for too long. His men followed Graham, the silent brute, shoulders like a wall, Tyler, the wiry one with the cruel grin, and Clint, eyes darting like a rat's. Caldwell stood with his hands on his hips, surveying the ruin of the cabin and the man who refused to leave it. "Morning, stranger," he called, his voice carrying easily in the still air. Or should I say squatter? "Didn't I tell you this was over?" Chuck didn't move at first. He stood among the ashes, His jacket blackened, his face calm. When he did speak, his tone was steady, level. You burned what I had. I don't have anything left to lose. Caldwell laughed, throwing his head back. That's where you're wrong. You've got your skin, don't you? And it'd be a shame to lose that too. His men chuckled behind him, the sound thin, practiced. Caldwell's eyes flicked toward the townsfolk gathered along the road. Their silence fed him. He puffed up his chest, spreading his arms. Let this be the day we remind folks what happens when you forget who runs this place. Chuck stepped forward, boots sinking into the ash. He spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. He's been taking from you for years. Your crops, your money, your boats, your children's laughter. He thinks fear makes him the law. But fear isn't law, it's chains. You can live bowed under them forever, or you can break them. The crowd shifted. A murmur ran through them. Caldwell's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. He turned on Chuck, his voice sharp. That's enough talk. Last chance. Get in your truck, drive away, and never come back. No, Chuck said simply. Caldwell's face reddened, his hand twitching near his holster. He barked a laugh, but it rang hollow. So be it. Boys. Graham moved first, stepping forward like a bull let loose. He swung a heavy fist toward Chuck's head, a blow that would have flattened most men. But Chuck was not most men. He sidestepped with the ease of long practice, the punch whistling past his shoulder, and drove his own hand into Graham's ribs. The big man grunted, staggered, then came again. Another swing, another miss. Chuck caught his arm, twisted, and with a sharp motion, sent him crashing to the ground. The crowd gasped. Tyler rushed in next, his grin wide, fists flying in a flurry. He was fast, wild, the kind of fighter who relied on chaos. Chuck blocked each strike, his arms moving like steel bars. Tyler snarled, lunging low, but Chuck met him with a knee to the chest that sent him sprawling. He wheezed, rolling onto his back. The grin wiped clean. Clint hung back, eyes flicking nervously between the fight and the crowd. When he saw Graham struggling on the ground and Tyler gasping for breath, he turned as though to run. But the townsfolk were there now, blocking his path. For the first time in years, they stood firm, their faces set, their fear cracking. Clint froze, his smirk gone, his eyes darting in panic. Caldwell snarled, fury twisting his face. He stormed forward, fists raised, swinging in a wide arc meant to put Chuck down fast. Chuck ducked, the blow cutting through empty air, and answered with a short, sharp strike to the chest. Caldwell stumbled back, his boots scraping against the blackened ground. The crowd gasped again, louder this time. You've used fear to hold this town hostage, Chuck said, his voice carrying clear across the road. That ends today. Caldwell roared, charging again, his fists flailing with rage rather than skill. Chuck blocked, deflected, redirected, until he caught Caldwell's wrist, twisted, and forced him to his knees. For a moment, the once proud man knelt in the ashes he had made, his breath ragged, his eyes wild. Chuck placed a boot lightly on his shoulder, not crushing, not gloating, just holding him there. The silence was absolute. The crowd stared, their hearts caught between fear and something new. Then slowly, voices began to rise. One man stepped forward. We're done being afraid, he said, his voice trembling but loud enough to carry. Another woman cried out, You don't own us, not anymore. Caldwell's head whipped around, eyes wide. He had never heard defiance like this. Not here, not from them. He struggled, but when Chuck released him, he scrambled back, humiliated, his authority shattered in front of the very people he had ruled. Chuck stepped away, his face calm, his body steady. He had not shouted, he had not gloated. He had simply stood, and in standing, he had shown them all what was possible. The murmurs grew into a rumble, a wave rolling through the crowd. For the first time in years, the people looked at one another with something other than fear. They looked with recognition, with courage, with the first sparks of freedom. Caldwell backed away, his men beaten, his power cracked. He spat into the ash, his voice hoarse. This isn't over. Then he turned, shoving past the people, retreating to his truck. His words were meant as a threat, but they sounded more like desperation. The crowd did not move to stop him. They did not need to. They had seen what they needed to see. Chuck remained among the ashes, silent, his breath calm, his eyes steady on the horizon. The fight had been short, but its meaning stretched further than fists and bruises. The fire that Caldwell had set to destroy him had instead lit something larger, something no water could douse. The people had seen him fall, and in that fall, they had remembered their own strength. The trucks roared away, engines fading into the distance. The crowd lingered, their voices rising in quiet defiance. Chuck turned toward them, nodded once, and then walked back to the ruin of the cabin. His steps were slow, deliberate, but inside he knew the truth. The battle was not finished, it had only just begun. The silence that followed the showdown at the ashes was unlike any silence the town had known in years. It was no longer the suffocating hush of fear, nor the brittle quiet of resignation. It was different now, lighter somehow, as though the very air had shifted. People walked the streets with cautious steps, still uncertain, but their eyes were no longer glued to the ground. For the first time in a long while, they looked at one another with something approaching recognition. The chains that had bound them were not fully gone, but they had cracked, and the sound of those cracks still echoed. The next morning, Caldwell's black truck prowled through the streets. He drove alone, his hands gripping the wheel tighter than usual, his jaw set in grim determination. The engine revved louder than it needed to, as though noise could replace the power he had lost. People paused in doorways and on porches, watching him pass. In the past, they would have lowered their heads or hurried inside, unwilling to catch his eye. But now they stood in place, their gazes steady, some crossing their arms, some even daring to look him in the eye. Caldwell felt the shift. He pressed the gas harder, but the sound of the engine could not drown out the realization that he was no longer feared in the way he once had been. By the second day, the cracks widened. Graham, the heavy-set brute, entered the diner where Caldwell was known to hold court. He stood by the counter, his voice loud enough for every patron to hear. "I'm done," he said flatly. "I signed on to keep peace, not to break it." His words carried weight. The owner of the diner froze mid-motion, eyes widening, and then slowly a smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Graham dropped his badge on the counter and walked out, leaving Caldwell to stew in silence. The following day, Tyler vanished. Some said he left town before dawn, ashamed or afraid. Others claimed they saw him slip into the sheriff's office, returning his badge without a word. Either way, he was gone, and the grip Caldwell once had through his loyal enforcers slipped further. Clint lingered for a time, his darting eyes even more nervous than before. But soon even he disappeared, swallowed by fear of what was coming next. With his men gone, Caldwell was left with nothing but his voice and his reputation, both of which were fading quickly. Chuck watched it unfold with the same calm he had shown at the ashes. He did not gloat, he did not strut through the streets. He repaired the loose boards on the truck bed, sharpened an axe by the ruin of the cabin, and cast his line into the lake as though nothing had changed. Yet when he walked into town for supplies, the difference was undeniable. The shopkeeper, once unable to meet his eyes, looked at him firmly and said, "Thank you." The young woman who had once wept in fear smiled openly as she passed, her basket on her hip. And the old man with the cane, who had long ago given up hope of seeing change, tapped his cane against the boards and said, "Told you he couldn't keep us bent forever." Chuck knew better than to think it was over. It was one thing to cheer when a tyrant was brought low. It was another to build something lasting from the ruins of fear. He stayed, quietly watching as the town began to reshape itself. A week after the fight at the ashes, the townsfolk gathered in the square. It was the first open assembly they had dared to hold in years. Families brought folding chairs, children clutched bread and apples, and an energy filled the air that was strange but hopeful. People stood and spoke, one after another, their voices trembling at first, then growing stronger as the words left their mouths. They spoke of fines that had drained them, of threats that had haunted their nights, of theft that had become routine. They spoke openly of Red Caldwell, naming him not as law but as the bully he was. And in speaking his name, They stripped it of its power. Caldwell himself appeared at the edge of the square, his face red, his body tense. He shouted, called them fools, claimed they were destroying the order that kept them safe. "You need me," he barked. "Without me, you'll fall apart." But the crowd answered him back. A man shouted, "You don't own us." A woman laughed, the sound ringing across the square. Then others joined, laughter rising, defiance becoming louder than Caldwell's rage. For the first time in years, he found himself shouting into a wall that would not bend. His voice faltered. His threats rang hollow. He left in his truck, tires spinning in frustration, but no one followed, and more importantly, no one feared him as he went. Within days, county officials arrived, summoned by letters and calls from the townsfolk who had finally found their voices. Testimonies were given, records uncovered, and the web Caldwell had spun over the years unraveled under scrutiny. The fines, the stolen goods, the intimidation, all of it laid bare. Papers were signed, charges prepared. Caldwell, once the self-proclaimed law of the town, was now facing the judgment of the very system he had corrupted. For the town, however, the true change was not in Caldwell's downfall, but in what came after. Freed from his grip, they gathered again and again, not in fear but in determination. They painted the sagging porches, repaired broken fences, and reopened shuttered shops. Families walked to the lake once more, children splashing in the shallows, fishermen casting their lines without fear of confiscation. The laughter that had been stolen from them returned, carried on the wind, bright and unafraid. Chuck watched it all with quiet satisfaction. He sat by the dock some afternoons, the ruins of his cabin behind him, the lake before him shimmering in the sun. Children ran past him with rods and buckets, and one boy stopped, staring up at him with wide eyes. "Mister, are you staying here forever?" he asked. Chuck smiled faintly, shook his head. "No," he said softly, "just long enough to make sure you can keep this place yours." The boy nodded solemnly as though he understood more than his years should have allowed, then raced off after his friends. In those moments, Chuck felt the worth of what had been done. Not the fight itself, not the blows landed or the ashes left behind, but the way the people had stood after. They no longer moved with their shoulders bent. They spoke with voices unbroken by fear. The shadow that had hung over them was gone, and in its place was something that looked very much like freedom. In time, Caldwell was taken away to face his consequences. The town did not falter without him. They carried on, stronger than before, building something he could no longer touch. They spoke of rebuilding on the site of Chuck's cabin, not for him, but as a symbol of their new beginning. Chuck refused gently. "That house was mine," he told them. "Now you need something that is yours." When the day finally felt right, Chuck packed his duffel. He folded the quilt he had salvaged from the ruins, swept the ash from the truck bed, and placed the old photograph back in his bag. He took one last long look at the lake, gleaming under the sun, children's voices echoing across the water. As he turned the key in the ignition, he saw the old man with the cane standing at the edge of the road. The man raised his hand in a slow salute. Chuck returned the gesture with a nod before driving away. The town shrank in the rearview mirror, its streets alive with people who now walked without chains, its lake shining like a promise kept. Chuck did not need to stay to know that it would endure. The fight had been theirs all along. He had only reminded them how to take it back. The road curved away into the forest, the trees closing in once more, the horizon stretching ahead. Chuck drove on, the same calm that had brought him here now deeper, steadier. He had not only found a measure of peace for himself, he had left it behind for others. And as the sunlight broke through the canopy, painting the road in gold, he carried with him the memory of a town reborn, of ashes turned to strength, and of a dawn that promised more than fear ever could. Don't miss what's coming next. Hit subscribe now and turn on the bell so you'll never skip a story like this. Watch the next video waiting for you right here and dive into more shocking stories from our channel. And if this one made you think, share it with your friends. Let them experience it too.